Welcome to American Law Café. So before we can even think about analyzing a single clause of the Constitution, we have to understand why it exists in the first place. Let's get into the conflicts and the crises that actually forged this document.
You know, the U.S. Constitution wasn't some academic exercise dreamed up in a quiet library. No way. This was a crisis document. It was a desperate solution to oppressive rule, a chaotic war, and a government that was literally on the verge of total collapse.
For any of you law students out there, this is the essential starting point. The actual text of the Constitution. It only really makes sense when you understand the struggles that shaped it. Every power that's granted and every limit that's imposed is basically an echo of a lesson that was learned the hard way. So this is the journey we're about to take. We're going from being subjects of a king to revolutionaries, to citizens of a failing state, and then finally to the architects of a whole new republic. You'll see how each step was a direct reaction to the one that came before it.
Okay, our story doesn't begin in Philadelphia. It starts way back, across the Atlantic, with all the European powers racing to claim a piece of the New World. And it was right here that England would lay the groundwork for a new and, as it turns out, a fiercely independent society. So you had Jamestown, founded to make a buck. Then you had Plymouth, founded for religious freedom. Over the next century and a half, 13 totally distinct colonies start to take root. They had different origins, different purposes, but over time they started to develop this shared identity, really forged by distance and circumstance.
For decades, Britain practiced something historians call salutary neglect. What does that mean? Well, essentially, they were just too busy with problems back home to micromanage the colonies. And this hands-off approach had this huge, unintended consequence. The colonists got really, really good at governing themselves. They built their own assemblies, they passed their own laws, and they developed this powerful sense of independence.
But that whole era of autonomy, it came to a screeching halt with the French and Indian War. This was a brutal, incredibly expensive conflict for control of North America, and its outcome would completely shatter the relationship between Britain and its colonies.
So Britain wins the war, right? They gain all this new territory from France. But that victory was ruinously expensive. So, Parliament, looking at this mountain of debt, turns its eyes toward the American colonies and decides, hey, it's time for them to pay their share. The period of salutary neglect was officially over.
And the escalation was just rapid and relentless. First, the Proclamation of 1763 tells colonists they can't even settle on the very land they just fought for. Then come the taxes, just one after another, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, which was a direct tax that hit everybody, and then the Townshend Acts. The pressure was building, and it was building fast.
And you've got to understand, this wasn't just about money. It was about a fundamental right. The colonists, who had 0 elected members in the British Parliament, argue that a government simply can't tax its people without their consent. To them, that was the very definition of tyranny.
So as Britain keeps tightening its grip, the colonial protests start to morph. They grow from these scattered riots into organized, unified political action. The colonies were starting to see themselves not as 13 separate little entities, but as one collective body with a shared problem.
So, in 1774, delegates from 12 of the colonies meet up in Philadelphia, and their goal wasn't independence. Not yet. They actually affirmed their loyalty to the king, but they demanded that their rights as British subjects be restored. They organized a massive boycott of British goods, and they agreed to meet again if London didn't listen.
Well, London didn't listen. King George III rejected their petitions completely. He saw their unified protest not as a plea for rights, but as an act of insurrection. The colonists reached out with an olive branch, and the king basically reached back with a sword.
And the king's hard-line response really forced the ultimate question. If their rights as British subjects were never going to be recognized, then what were they? His flat-out refusal to negotiate just shattered any hope of reconciliation and pushed the colonies toward a radical, brand-new answer.
By the time the Second Continental Congress met, war had already broken out. So on July 4th, 1776, they made it official. They adopted a document that was part legal argument, part philosophical statement, and part declaration of war. It was a formal, legal break that turned colonies into states.
But, declaring independence, that was the easy part. Now they actually had to govern themselves. And their first attempt, the Articles of Confederation, was shaped by one single overriding fear: creating a central government that was just as powerful and tyrannical as the one they had just escaped.
The result was a government that was, well, it was almost designed to fail. I mean, look at this. Congress could declare war, but it couldn't raise an army without basically begging the states for troops. It could borrow money, but it had zero power to tax anyone to pay it back. It really was just a league of friendship, not a nation.
And the results were a complete disaster. The national government was bankrupt. States were fighting economic wars against each other. And when a rebellion of indebted farmers broke out in Massachusetts, Shays' Rebellion, the federal government was totally powerless to stop it. And here's the crucial point. Freedom without order was proving to be just as dangerous as tyranny.
So by 1787, the nation is teetering on the brink of collapse. It was crystal clear the Articles couldn't be fixed. The country's leaders knew they had one last chance to get it right, a final gamble to create a government that was strong enough to survive, but not so strong that it would crush liberty.
And it started with a failed trade meeting in Annapolis, where only 5 states even bothered to show up. It was a total dud. But instead of just giving up, the delegates who were there made a really bold move. They called for another convention in Philadelphia, not just to talk trade, but to rethink the entire structure of the government.
When the delegates gathered in Philadelphia in 1787, they realized pretty quickly that just tweaking the Articles wasn't going to cut it. So what they do? They locked the doors, swore an oath of secrecy, and began drafting an entirely new framework for the nation, completely from scratch.
And that right there is the key takeaway. The Constitution wasn't created in a vacuum. It was the direct result of everything we've just discussed. It was a response to a tyrannical king, a bloody revolution, and the total chaos of a failed first government. Every single clause is a solution to a problem they had literally lived through.
Understanding this foundation is absolutely crucial to interpreting our entire legal system. If you found this explanation useful, be sure to follow our channel for more. And for more on this topic, check out the full American Law Café series. We've seen how the Constitution was an answer to the problems of the 18th century. But that leaves a big question for us today, right? How well does it answer the problems of today? Thanks for joining us.